The input hypothesis is at the very core of all of AJAT, and this is because it tells us exactly how humans actually acquire language. Humans acquire language unconsciously through comprehending input in that language. What this means for a language learner is that the quality and quantity of your output is a function of the quality and quantity of your input. This is actually quite a profound statement because it reduces all of language learning into only two factors, the quality and the quantity of your input. So now let's go into all the subtle implications of this statement. The more straightforward of the two is obviously quantity. The more, the better. On the AJAT website, Katsumoto talks a lot about getting as much input as possible, including making all new friends, changing your phone language to your L2, and even listening while you sleep. Now, I think the reason that Katsumoto stressed this so much is because in certain aspects, it is the more important of the two. No matter what the situation is, some listening is always better than no listening, and I would say for a majority of cases, the deciding factor for whether someone's going to reach fluency or not is going to be quantity, not quality. But nevertheless, your quantity of input is really only half the picture, because the higher your quality of input, then the more you're going to be gaining for each second you spend inputting. Now, this really starts to become important when you start dealing with trying to fill the gap between fluency and native level. But what does it mean for input to be of high quality? Well, first and foremost, it means it's as close to I+1 as possible. If what you're using for input is far too above your level, then you're obviously not going to be able to take very much away from that, and if what you're using is way too easy for you, then you're obviously not going to learn too much from that either. In addition to this, your input should ideally be something that's interesting to you and be something that you enjoy. The more invested you are in what you're watching or listening to, then the easier it's going to be to really stay engaged, which is going to naturally help you pick up and notice more subtleties of language. Now this brings me to my next point. Now when it really comes down to filling that gap to perfection, like I said before, everything really comes down to how much you can notice. Now we know as a general principle that the brain likes to do as little work as possible, and this is no exception for language acquisition. See, whenever we're learning a new skill, in order for improvement to happen, we have to first fail in some sort of way. You attempt to do something, like say throw a ball into a hoop, and then you miss, and then your brain kind of does a rough calculation of how far it was off so that it can try to correct for the next time. So if you never make that initial failure, then your brain doesn't really have any frame of reference to try to make any calculations in order to improve on, if you know what I'm saying. So what happens in language acquisition is we start listening to a new language, and of course we don't understand it. But every instance of hearing something and not understanding it is in a sense a failure, and this activates the language acquisition center in the brain and it starts trying to figure it all out. So this is why at the beginning things are mostly smooth sailing. The more you listen, then the more you start to understand. But what seems to happen to most people is that once they start to hit basic fluency, they're understanding almost all of their input, so they don't have that initial failure anymore, and this leads to plateau because basically the language acquisition center stops getting activated. And I think this is why a lot of advanced language learners never end up picking up all the little nuances that really make a native speaker sound native. Now, it only seems natural that the closer attention you're paying to your input, then the more likely it is that you're going to notice more and in turn pick up more subtleties. So really, the biggest factor in the quality of your input is your quality of attention. Now, I think quality of attention can be kind of talked about in two different ways. The first way is in a more general sense. So naturally, if you're, say, bored or tired or pissed off, then of course you're not going to be able to use 100% of your brain power to focus on the input. So stated another way, do everything in your ability to cultivate as much of a calm, alert, and equanimous mind state as possible. Now, separate from your state of mind, there's also just your pure ability to concentrate. Concentration is a lot like a muscle, where the more you exercise it, then the stronger it gets. But because almost no one in our society actively cultivates this concentration muscle, they're nowhere near their full potential. Now, these two reasons are actually why I think that a daily meditation practice could actually make a huge difference over the long term for any serious language learner. Not only is meditating pretty much like hitting the gym for your concentration muscle, but it also pretty consistently tends to lead to more equanimous mind states in daily life. And I really think this is the key to perfecting the quality of your input. Now, we can also talk about quality of attention in a more specific sense. What I mean here is singling out one aspect of language that you want to pay attention to and really honing in on that one aspect. Now, broadly, I think you could break this up into three categories. First, what is being said, then what words are being used to express that, and lastly, how are those words being said? Now, first we have what is being said. Now, this is more of a cultural aspect. So Japanese people just say different things in general than American people. So if you really want to be able to communicate well with Japanese people, you have to pay attention to the kind of things that they tend to say. Next, we have how are those things actually being expressed? Now, this is more of a kind of technical language aspect where I mean, what specific vocabulary is being used in what ways and how are they wording expressions and things. Now those first two categories you could either apply to listening or reading, but this last category, how are those words actually being said? I'm actually talking about intonation and accent and things like that, so that obviously only applies to listening. Now, in addition to these three broad categories, you can also try to pay attention to things like lip movements or facial expressions or body gestures if you're watching a drama or a movie. You can also try to hone in on something that you know is your weak point. Like, for example, if you want to start talking more manly, you can really pay attention when like badass male characters are talking. So basically, this goes off the idea that specific intention is very powerful. So instead of just sitting there absentmindedly hoping that you'll pick up something new, if you have a very specific intention and really hone in on one specific aspect, it makes it much more likely that you'll actually pick up something new. So there you have it. Now I know especially that last part probably sounds like a lot or maybe a pain in the ass. So I mean, if you're a beginner, that's fine. You don't really need to worry about it yet because like I said, just by listening, you'll acquire plenty. But once you start getting advanced, I think that's really what it takes if you're hoping to reach perfection. And I know Katz never really talked about that, but I think that was just because he didn't want to scare people away, and 99% of the people reading the site were beginners anyway, so it wouldn't have been relevant to them. But here you go. I found that this is what I needed to do for me to really bump up to the next level, and I hope it works for you too.